Hello everyone, and welcome to Strategy.
This is a series of videos explaining business strategy. Today, we will cover the network level strategy. Let's start again by the definition of strategy. Remember what a business is? A business is a product and a market. Using this definition, we will develop a notion of network level strategy. Network level strategy happens when different corporations have relations between them, or there are relationships between the businesses within any of these corporations. In general, they are called inter-firm relationships. These inter-firm relationships will take the form of arrangements between companies or between organizations or between firms. Now, these arrangements may be multilateral or bilateral, and at the same time they can be non-contractual, they can be contractual, or they can be equity-based. I'll go one by one, giving you an example every time. First, a multilateral non-contractual relationship is, for example, the one held to develop Linux. It's done by many developers across the world, and all of them contribute to the development of Linux. A multilateral contractual relationship is, for example, the One World Alliance or any airline alliance where your miles count for whichever airline is in the alliance. An example of multilateral equity-based is the construction of the Eurotunnel, which was financed by the European Union, by the British government and by the French government, all together invested, making a dream a reality. An example of a bilateral relation that is non-contractual is, for example, the one that happens between Intel and Microsoft. Every time a new software is needed, Intel has to develop a new chip. And then every time a new chip comes, a new software is needed. By mutually collaborating, they make us buy a new computer every year. Then an example of a bilateral relationship that is contractual is a recent one, the one between Pfizer and biotech to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. Actually, it's not the only example. Many of the pharmaceutical companies are joining forces to develop a vaccination. And finally, a bilateral relationship that is equity-based was the one formed between Google and NASA to develop Google Earth that you use every day. All these arrangements between companies can be strategic alliances or mergers and acquisitions or just relationships with no name. You may wonder, why do strategic alliances exist? Wouldn't it be easier to just start a new business or stay with your own business? Well, not always. There are several reasons. The first reason is that if you join forces with another company, you strengthen your competitive position. You become closer to a monopoly and you can charge more, have more control of competition, perhaps makes things easier. You can also enhance market power. So perhaps you want to increase the price or dominate a segment, and you can do that with an alliance. You can develop efficacies or develop innovation that you wouldn't have been able to develop alone. You can have access to critical resources, for example, knowledge that you don't have, but another company has, but the other company doesn't have knowledge that you have. You can also access capital markets that perhaps you wouldn't have been able to access. And finally, you may be able to access markets that you cannot access by yourself. Typically in China, if you don't make a joint venture with a local company, you won't be able to access that market. In general, over 20% of the assets in the world are in strategic alliances and over 30% of the R&D. But, unfortunately, between 30 and 70% of alliances fail. They tend to fail because the relationship fails. And they tend to fail more in the downturn, but they accelerate during recovery. They fail because they don't meet the goals that the parent companies had, or perhaps they don't deliver the operational or strategic benefits they were set up for. Alliance termination is unfortunately over 50%, and they end up resulting in value destruction, which is really sad. So, as we're seeing, in strategic alliances, what matters is the relationship, is the inter-firm relationship. Now, this inter-firm relationship can be of several sorts, depending on the dependency relationship and depending on the power that each party has. You can have mutual independence in which interaction is carried out in each firm's own terms, and there's no penalty for breaking the relationship. But you can have an unbalanced independence in which both are independent, but one is more than the other one. Then the one that is more independent will have more power. You can also have mutual dependence, which is based on a tight relationship and an interdependent relationship, and this is likely to produce a balanced relationship. But you can have an unbalanced dependence, which is an asymmetrical dependence, in which the one that has more freedom will impose the terms on the one that has less freedom. The conditions between the two parties, profiled by these four states, will determine the relational agreement. The agreement will be based on this mutual relationship. And determining how this relationship works is the objective of the network level strategy. In order to summarize alliances, there are a lot of them, and they're happening more and more. In your professional career, you're likely to take part in one or more strategic alliances. The key for the alliance to be successful is the compatibility between the parties and being able to sustain a mutually useful relationship, which has to go beyond the economic logic. Now, alliances are found primarily in the Western world and in the developed world, but they're developing more and more in other parts of the world. For example, if you want to enter the Chinese market and your company is not Chinese, then you have to access it through a joint venture with a Chinese company. In general, alliances are a way to access resources that cannot be made or bought by the firm. One specific example of a relationship between companies, and that is worth explaining on its own, is the one of mergers and acquisitions, and the effect it has on corporate strategy. Well, first, why are mergers and acquisitions bundled together? Well, because they're the same thing. Each merger that you see will eventually become an acquisition. Acquisitions can create shareholders' value by facilitating implementation of several strategies. For example, it can lead to a rapid expansion in existing businesses. So you buy your competitors, and by doing so, you increase the expansion. It helps entry into new businesses, diversification, remember. It also helps entering into new geographies, like the example of China I just gave. It allows you to access new competencies. When Facebook buys WhatsApp, it's because there's something going on in WhatsApp that they don't know. They want to acquire the competencies. It changes the competitive game as well by changing the way markets operate. And finally, can create new markets or new market spaces by serving unsatisfied or unrealized demand. And this is definitely value innovation. Ultimately, any strategic alliance or any M&A will have to prove that there's value creation because of their existence. Now, where is the value potential contained? It can be primarily within one or two firms, or it could be contained in the interaction between these two firms. You have to determine how is exactly value supposed to be generated. Is it from exploiting existing resources? Is it from developing new resources and capabilities? Now, when network level strategy creates value, it affects corporate strategy. And now we're linking it to the previous episode. There has to be an existence of a clear and agreed strategic goal that's a necessary precondition for success. what is the alliance set up to do. But this is generally not sufficient. For a given corporate strategy to be successful, it has to be implemented adequately, of course, and the tool has to be used appropriately. Success needs to be analyzed and quantified in terms of value creation for stakeholders. If value creation doesn't exist in the long term, then the strategic alliance will eventually be disbanded or dismantled. Okay, this is the end of network level strategy.